In the early summer of 1914, European diplomats went on vacation.
Yeah, they were literally at the beach.
Right. I mean, the Archduke of Austria-Hungary had been assassinated in June, sure, but financial markets are totally stable. Nobody in London or Paris or Berlin thought a global war was happening.
No, not at all. They really didn't see it coming.
And yet, just 6 weeks later, millions of men were marching to their deaths, locked into a conflict dictated, quite literally, by train timetables.
It's wild. It is the defining structural failure of the 20th century.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We are taking a massive stack of notes, historical analyses, and some really fascinating personal reflections, specifically through this creative lens our sources call the Tommy subpersonality, to deconstruct World War I.
Yeah, and we should clarify right away, this won't be your standard historical timeline of, dates and battles.
Yeah. Exactly. No textbook recitations here. We're looking at 1914 through 1918 through the lens of systems design. So let's unpack this. What happens when a global system is built with high pressure, tight coupling, and absolutely no release valve?
Well, you get a mechanism that is essentially preloaded to snap. WWI was not a spontaneous explosion or just a simple good versus bad conflict.
Right, it was way more complicated than that.
It was this tightly wound mechanism, and the mission today is to understand the architecture of that failure. Because if you can see how this broke, you can understand how any complex system, whether it's political or corporate or even personal, collapses under stress.
So whether you're analyzing modern global politics or you're just incredibly curious about how things break down, you're going to want to hear how this preloaded machine locked everyone in.
Yeah, you really do, because from the outside, it looked flawless.
It did. Before the machine broke, it looked perfect. So let's look at that illusion of stability. Pre-1914, Europe appeared incredibly stable.
Oh, absolutely. It seemed like a golden age. I mean, there hadn't been a major continental war since 1871.
Right. Economies were booming. The Second Industrial Revolution was happening.
Yeah, but structurally, our sources describe it as a beautifully painted wall with severe, deep-running cracks right in the foundation.
Beautifully painted wall. I like that. And the pressure behind those cracks usually gets taught as an acronym, right? MAIN. Militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism.
Right, the classic high school history acronym. But we need to look at the actual mechanisms of those forces, because they weren't just abstract ideas.
No, they were physical realities. Let's start with militarism. How did that create this massive distortion of intent?
Well, the underlying dynamic is what political scientists call the security dilemma.
Okay, what is that exactly?
It's a mutual fear loop. Basically, one nation's defensive actions are automatically interpreted by their neighbor as offensive threats.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and the best example in the sources is the Anglo-German naval arms race. So, in 1906, Britain launches the HMS Dreadnought.
The famous battleship.
Right. It was so advanced, heavily armored, big guns, that it instantly made every other battleship on Earth obsolete.
Wait, so by trying to secure their absolute dominance, Britain actually levered the playing field, because now everyone else is just starting from zero.
Exactly. That is the tragic irony. Germany looks at this and goes, well, our old fleet was outmatched anyway, but now, now we just have to outbuild them in this one specific new class of ship.
Oh, wow. So they just start pouring resources into their own dreadnoughts.
Yeah, and Britain sees Germany building these massive warships right across the North Sea, and they panic because Britain's entire survival relies on sea control.
Right, they're an island, so they build more.
And Germany sees Britain building more, feels threatened, and accelerates their program.
So both sides firmly believe, like in their own war rooms, that they are acting defensively.
Completely.
But objectively, they are just cranking up the tension and filling the room with gasoline.
That's exactly what's happening. And while all this industrial metal is being forged, you have the human element, nationalism, acting as this relentless fragmenting force.
Right, especially inside these multi-ethnic empires, like Austria-Hungary. Let's talk about them, because that is a wild paradox.
It really is. Austria-Hungary was a dual monarchy, this massive empire with Germans, Hungarians, Czechs, Slovaks, Poles, Ukrainians, Croats, Serbs.
Just a massive patchwork.
Yeah.
So the state desperately required unity to survive.
Yes. But the nationalist identities, especially Slavic nationalism down in Serbia, were fundamentally fragmenting it.
So it's like a system that requires cohesion, but the individual pieces are demanding autonomy.
Right. And if you suppress a force without providing a release valve, you just increase the pressure over time.
Which brings us to the alliances.
Mm.
Because the way these nations tie themselves together seems completely insane in retrospect.
It really does. You had the Triple Entente with France, Russia, and Britain, and the Triple Alliance with Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Italy.
And the idea was deterrence,
Yeah.
right? Like, my gang is so big you wouldn't dare attack me.
Ostensibly, yes. But the treaties had secret military clauses. They mandated automatic, massive troop mobilizations within specific hour frame.
Hour frames, not days or weeks.
No, hours. The decision-making structures were completely inflexible.
It's like playing a terribly designed video game. Like, every move auto-triggers the next sequence, and no player is allowed to hit the pause button without instantly losing their strategic position.
That is the perfect analogy. And the ultimate example of this, the preloaded script, is Germany's Schlieffen Plan.
Okay, let's really dig into this. Because it wasn't just a map with arrows. It was reliant on, what, thousands of train timetables?
Yes, it was an operational behemoth. Germany knew they'd face a two-front war. France on the west, Russia on the east.
A geographical nightmare.
Exactly. So the assumption was that Russia, being huge and less industrialized, would take about 6 weeks to fully mobilize. So the German mathematical logic was, we have exactly 6 weeks to throw everything at France, crush them, and then put all our soldiers on trains back east to meet the Russians.
Wait, so if Russia merely starts mobilizing its army, even just as a diplomatic bluff, Germany cannot wait to see what happens?
Nope. The timetable has started. The German High Command literally could not hit pause.
Because if they wait, the formula fails.
Right. The moment Russia mobilized, Germany had to attack France. And to do that, the plan required going through neutral Belgium.
Which instantly brings Britain into the war because they had a treaty protecting Belgium.
Exactly. So the decisions leaders were making weren't, hey, what should we do? The decisions were, which script has been activated?
That is terrifying. It completely removes human flexibility. Which brings us to the spark in Sarajevo, June 28, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand is assassinated by a Serbian nationalist.
Right, the famous inciting incident.
But our sources say that calling this the cause of the war completely misses the point.
It really does. The Archduke was actually a reformist. He wanted to give the Slavs more autonomy, which might have cooled things down.
Oh, the irony. So his death wasn't the cause, it was just the trigger event that activated the unstable network.
Exactly. If the system is a room filled with gas, the assassin just struck a match. If not him, something else would have sparked it eventually.
Right. So Austria-Hungary gives Serbia an impossible ultimatum. Serbia mostly agrees, but not enough. War is declared. Russia mobilizes.
And that triggers the Schlieffen Plan.
Germany declares war on Russia, attacks France through Belgium. Britain declares war on Germany. And suddenly, millions of men are marching out, expecting a quick, glorious victory, right?
Oh, yeah. They all thought they'd be home by Christmas.
But they run headfirst into a brutal new reality.
Right, so the script activates, and we hit what the sources call the catastrophic mismatch.
Old minds meeting new machines.
Precisely. You had a total collision of old mental models with new industrial technology.
The old minds believed in the romance of war, right? Cavalry charges, honor, quick victories.
Yes, the rules of engagement were entirely outdated. But the tools of destruction were modern. Machine guns, heavy artillery, chemical weapons.
It's a slaughter.
It was.
Yeah.
You had generals ordering infantry to charge across open fields right into water-cooled Maxim machine guns that fired 600 rounds a minute.
So, of course, the quick war of movement grinds to a halt. They have to dig into the earth just to survive.
And that gives us trench warfare, a static, defensive, grinding stalemate. Progress wasn't measured in miles anymore. It was measured in yards.
And the sensory reality of this?
Yeah.
The sources paint such a visceral picture. It's totally flattened. Muted grays, brown mud, repetitive barbed wire.
Yeah, very little verticality left. Trees are shattered, and the mud was so thick it could swallow a horse.
That is horrifying.
Oh.
And the soundscape. The war is heard before it is seen.
Right. Up to 70% of casualties on the Western Front were from heavy artillery. Death came unseen from miles away.
This constant low thunder.
Yeah.
And then sudden silence.
Which was worse because silence just meant the chaos was resetting.
But the war wasn't just the Western Front. The geography was totally different elsewhere.
Oh, completely. The Eastern Front was fluid, vast, chaotic, dense forests and plains.
In the Ottoman fronts.
Down in the Middle East and Gallipoli, it was about exhaustion and dehydration. The environment itself was trying to kill you.
So here's what gets really interesting to me. They have all this modern killing power, but they are still using horses for transport and slow messengers. It's like having a 5G network for dropping bombs, but dial-up internet for telling your troops to stop.
That is a brilliant way to put it. The communication infrastructure simply could not keep pace with the destructive infrastructure.
How bad was the lag?
Awful. A general miles behind the line uses a telegraph to order an attack, but once the soldiers go into no man's land, the wires get blown up.
So how do they talk back?
Runners. Literally guys sprinting through bullets. Or pigeons.
Pigeons against machine guns.
Exactly. So commanders operated on massive delays. They were making decisions based on battlefields that didn't exist anymore.
So that exact lag in communication created totally separate realities. Let's look at who was actually trapped inside this machine.
Yeah, because nobody is experiencing the full picture. It fractures into three completely divergent realities: leaders, soldiers, and civilians.
Okay, let's start with the leaders. The Kaiser, the Tsar, Clemenceau. What's their reality?
Their reality was maps, wooden tables, and delayed reports. They experienced the abstract pressure of consequence.
The sources talk about information gaps here.
Right, because they were insulated from the sensory horror. No smell of mud, no sound of shells. Their decisions felt clean.
Clean decisions, horrific consequences. But wait, I have to push back on this. After a battle like the Somme, where the British lose tens of thousands of men on the first day, didn't anyone say, hey, maybe this isn't working?
You'd think so, but that is the commitment trap. Once you've committed massive blood and treasure, backing out is politically costlier than pushing forward with bad strategies.
The sunk cost fallacy, but with human lives.
Exactly. How do you tell the public that those men died for nothing? You
No.
can't, so you double down.
Right, so the leaders are playing chess via mail. Meanwhile, the soldiers, they are just trying not to drown in mud.
Yes. For the soldier, fear is just background noise. Routine is survival. You clean your rifle, you boil tea.
And you bond with your squad. You're not fighting for the Kaiser anymore. You're fighting for the guy next to you.
The profound bonds of small unit brotherhood. That was their entire world.
And then the third reality, the civilians. They are reading a fantasy novel about how well the war is going.
Yeah, their reality is scarcity and rationing, but intellectually, it's a tightly controlled, mediated reality driven by state propaganda.
Because morale is a strategic resource, just like artillery shells.
Precisely. The governments minimize losses and dehumanize the enemy.
So they really aren't even fighting the same war in their minds.
No, and the tragic synthesis here is that everyone was acting rationally within their own limited perspective. But the total system they created was entirely irrational.
So when a rational system behaves irrationally for 4 years, how does it evolve? Because it doesn't just sit still, it mutates.
Right. Systems under extreme stress always show specific evolutionary behaviors. And WWI progressed through distinct phases reacting to previous failures.
Okay, map those phases out for us.
Sure. Phase 1 is movement in 1914, the Schlieffen Plan, but that fails at the Marne. So the system is forced into Phase 2, stalemate and entrenchment through 1915 and 1916.
The trenches. But if no one is winning, how do they redefine victory?
That's the darkest systemic shift. Victory shifted from winning battles to simply outlasting the enemy's suffering, an equilibrium of pure attrition.
Verdun is the prime example of that, right?
Exactly. The German commander literally wanted to use Verdun as a meat grinder to bleed France white.
Mathematically modeled slaughter, just horrifying.
Yeah.
And then it mutates again.
Yes, Phase 3 is escalation in 1916 and 1917. The U.S. enters the war, and Russia exits due to revolution. Technology accelerates.
And finally, Phase 4, the breakdown in 1918.
Right. Germany tries one last offensive, fails, and the system reaches total structural exhaustion.
But looking at this, what happens to the societies themselves during this? The sources point out a crucial systems insight about unity.
Yes. Unity is strongest at the very beginning. Nationalism is high. But it fractures precisely when the system needs it most late in the war.
Right, you get mutinies, strikes, revolutions.
Economies become weapons, but also huge vulnerabilities. If you get blockaded, you starve.
And ideologies radicalize. What started as honorable defense distorts into total war. Civilian suffering is normalized.
Which lays the psychological groundwork for extreme ideologies like communism and fascism later on.
Wow. But what does that sheer scale of attrition do to the human mind? Our sources provide a very unique, almost intimate lens on this. The Tommy subpersonality. Let's dig into that.
Yeah, this is a fascinating creative framework. It's a way to understand the psychological toll. Think of Tommy named after Tommy Atkins, the slang for a British soldier, as a creative mind thrust into a machine.
Right. The war is structurally anti-creative. It's repetitive, mechanical, totally indifferent to the individual.
A shell doesn't care if you're a poet or a baker.
Exactly. So the core conflict for a creative mind becomes, how do I create meaning inside a system that actively erases it?
And you see a massive shift here. Leaders had a failure of imagination under pressure. They couldn't rewrite the story they were trapped in.
This hits hard. It's like being an author trapped inside a tragedy where someone removed the backspace key. You can't fix a plot. You can only document the crash.
That is beautifully put. You shift from being a creator to being an archivist.
Because when imagination cannot escape reality, creation becomes defiance.
Exactly. Sketching a trench layout or scribbling a note, it's an act of resistance against a system that devalues human life.
It's a shift from global meaning to local meaning. You can't ask why humanity is doing this globally. You just find meaning in sharing a ration or keeping your boots dry.
Shared cigarette, a moment of connection, that becomes everything.
So the archivist documents the crash, and finally, in 1918, the machine stops running. The armistice is signed. But did it actually turn off?
Well, no. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 didn't resolve the underlying system problems.
It patched a cracked structure while increasing the internal pressure.
Right. Heavy reparations on Germany, redrawing borders without any cultural alignment.
Yeah.
It was a disaster.
And four massive empires just collapse. German, Austro-Hungarian, Ottoman, and Russian, all gone.
Global power shifts away from Europe toward the U.S. and the newly formed Soviet Union.
And we really have to dismantle some myths here, based on the sources. The war wasn't caused by one event.
No.
There were no clear good versus bad sides.
Exactly.
And leaders weren't strictly incompetent, they were just heavily constrained by the system.
Right. Our sources say it wasn't destiny, it was design under pressure.
And the cultural shift was profound. It broke the narrative of human progress. It birthed modernism in art and literature, deep skepticism toward institutions.
Disillusionment became the new reality.
You know, we always talk about winners and losers, but looking at this, the winners just inherited exhaustion, and the losers developed dangerous narratives of grievance. France is devastated, Britain is broke, Russia collapses into revolution.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, victory didn't produce stability, it just redistributed instability.
Oh, wow. WWI functioned as a prelude, shaping the exact conditions for WWII.
It really did.
Well, we have mapped how a beautifully painted wall cracked today, how a preloaded machine trapped millions in mud and noise, and how systems, when they can't adapt, eventually break the humans inside them.
Yeah, we often try to compress complexity into simple narratives, but WWI resists that. Prolonged conflict forces you to stop fighting for your original reasons and start fighting just to survive the consequences of staying in.
Absolutely. Before you go, I want you to think about the invisible loss of this war, the opportunity cost. We always count the millions of tragic deaths, the borders redrawn, the empires that fell. But think about the 4 years of human labor, technological genius, and massive global economic output that was poured directly into destruction. Imagine if that exact same energy, pressure, and innovation had been used for infrastructure, medicine, or science. Entire futures, entire parallel worlds of human progress were simply never built.
It's staggering to think about.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.